ports are creatures of municipalities, counties, or states. They are not federal animals. And the federal government was only very lightly involved in funding our nation's ports. Now that's starting to change.
That was the voice of Chris Connor, CEO of the American Association of Port Authorities. You'll hear us have a great discussion about the many challenges facing ports today and what the future holds as we emerge from a post-COVID world. Hopefully, digitization will make our supply chains more resilient. Thanks for listening to the podcast, and don't forget to follow. And now on to the show. Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. On today's podcast, we have Chris Connor, CEO of AAPA. AAPA, or the American Association of Port Authorities, is a unified voice of the seaport industry in the Americas, representing more than 130 public port authorities in the U.S., Canada, the Caribbean, and Latin America. America's seaports, as represented by AAPA, are the center of our nation's trade and transportation system. International trade through seaports accounts for over 1/4 of the U.S. gross domestic product, and seaports handle approximately $6 billion worth of import and export goods on a daily basis. This generates nearly 31 million jobs and provides more than $378 billion annually in federal, state, and local tax revenues. For its U.S. members, AAPA provides compelling advocacy and effective public outreach to influence seaports' most urgent public policy issues. Chris, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on. This is great because this is one of the first people we were talking before the show. One of the first times we're going to talk about the ports and digitization, and I'm excited. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Chris, thank you, and a pleasure to be here.
So let's just talk about, a lot of my audience and a lot of people who've listened to the pod and my own background are on the bulk side, particularly on the tankers and on the dry. Talk a little bit about what AAP does, because I don't think a lot of folks, at least from my traditional background, know what it does.
Yeah, thanks for that. And we love to always give that profile. So AAPA, American Association of Port Authorities, from a Western hemispheric point of view, we're really the voice of the industry. We're the convener of the industry. We bring the industry together through a variety of platforms, including seminars and events that we run. In that broader context, it's an opportunity to get people to talk to one another and learn about best practices. In COVID, for example, this was particularly prominent, and we'll probably chat a little bit more about that later. That was all new for everybody in the port industry, and to be able to leverage experiences about how people were handling health and safety protocols and the like was huge. The sharp edge of the knife of what we do is for our 85 or so U.S. port members, and that's the advocacy work that we do on Capitol Hill on behalf of public ports, and that is to create policy and legislation, and most importantly, to create funding mechanisms to help ports build out their infrastructure, their footprints, the intermodal connectivity, and to be a more efficient part of the goods movement industry, which you just touched on all the data points about it. It's huge and crazy, in a way, not well understood. Folks that live in and around ports, drive by ports every day, really don't connect the dots between what's happening at that port facility, whether it's a big container port or whether it's a bulk facility handling grain or construction aggregates. They don't really connect what's happening there to how that influences their daily lives. So it is part of our mission is to be that voice, to be that educator, not only with elected officials, but with the public writ large. And Chris, it's a full-time job, right? Because there's a lot of surround sound out there that we're competing with to get people's attention about how important it is. I will say, just to kind of close off this question, COVID in that respect helped a lot, right? Because it put this huge spotlight on supply chain broadly, ports more specifically. Folks around the dinner table were actually talking about ports and supply chain. And I had friends of mine who I've known for years who didn't give a hoot and holler about, what I did. They just thought I was, logistics guy. Suddenly, I was interesting. They wanted to talk to me because of what was happening. So I think, we've had some wind at our back, over the last 16 to 18 months, and it's definitely favorably influenced our ability to get things done on behalf of the port industry.
And yeah, and I think it's kind of taking that opportunity to do that, because that's the same thing, even being on more of the bulk side of things, certainly people are very interested in that. And you can't go past, just driving down. I'm here in the Northeast and driving past, the terminals in New Jersey, right? I mean, it's literally right there. And most people just, most days just drive by it. When I drive by it, my wife gets mad at me because I want to figure out what ships are where. And she's like, would you please drive? Because
keep your eyes on the road.
I'm like, well, what's it doing?
It's interesting because we compete in some ways for sympathy, empathy, interest with airports. Right.
Exactly.
People understand airports because it relates more, to them as individuals, because it's that conduit to either getting someplace they want to go or coming back from someplace they've been to. The public is more familiar with the intricacies of airport operations, not so with port operations. So that's part of our mission, to help make that communication stick.
Even if you haven't been on an airplane, and I know some people who haven't traveled as much as others. Probably in our industry, we travel a little more than people in other jobs that don't require travel. But you've dropped somebody off at the airport. Somebody who's been at the airport. But how many people do you know have been through a gate at a container terminal? Or, my case, I used to go in and out of tanker ports. How many people do you know knows what that's like, know what it means to pick up a pilot, to drop off a pilot, to wait for a bunker barge, to wait for a berth? Very few people do. And I think that the advocacy, and I know that, come in the form of what you guys do. I'm going to wave the flag here. I used to be president of the Connecticut Maritime Association, of what we try to do, and other great associations, whether it's the Singapore Shipping Association, whether it's, I'm at a loss for some of the other ones, but there are so many advocacy groups, whether it's direct what you're trying to do with is more government lobbying, or more kind of where CMA was a social organization where it had a mission to educate as well. So I think there's a lot there. And I think that the internet and social media, including platforms like this, can help shine a little bit of a light in an easier way for that. You talk about something interesting. You talk about advocacy. You talk about, shining light for, for the elected officials, putting aside any specific politics. One of the big things that kind of came up is, obviously funds for ports and making the ports better. Talk about a little bit, shifting a little bit to what the podcast is about, the digitization of the ports. Is that something that comes up, and how has that been part of what you're trying to explain to the congressional leaders there?
Again, COVID made this a national issue. And again, I say overall, that's been a positive, but everybody wants to be part of the solution, and therein lies the rub. So, we've been supportive of, let's say, congressional interest in action, but you have to watch that pretty closely, because sometimes the best intentions actually can end up making something more complicated and more cumbersome and less efficient than it even was in its worst. Digitization is a part of that conversation. The government's been super active now through the Federal Maritime Commission with something called the Marine Transportation Data Initiative, MTDI. That's a FMC initiative. And then really the White House, through the office, the Port Envoy and Supply Chain Office, has been championing something called FLOW, Freight Logistics Optimization Works, and really using the bully pulpit, if you will, of the administration to try to nudge all these public and private sector actors together to beta test what a real cooperative digital sharing system could look like. Results to be determined. But on that question of digitization, and this is where my 40 years of being around this industry, comes into play. I think back to how the industry started. If you come out of, post World War II, we had a very strong domestic economy. We were very domestically focused in our economy, less so internationally focused. And as international trade developed over the ensuing generations, organizational structures developed alongside them. And in my 40 years of being around international transportation, you see that companies were set up. They had domestic transportation teams. Then they had separate international transportation teams. The domestic guys would negotiate like hell with the truck operators, the warehouse operators, the railroads. The international guys would negotiate like heck with the deep sea ocean carriers and the terminal operators and try to negotiate the best terms and conditions for the services that those entities sold. But the net result, I strongly believe, the net result of that is those service providers built information management systems within the confines of what they are being asked to serve. And I truly believe that follow the money, and the money that fuels the movement of goods comes from the owner of the goods. They pay for the services. And I think in those days, and not until very recently, no one was really looking out over the horizon and thinking about connecting the origin to the destination. And had they, I think this data influence and how data is shared across goods movement would have accelerated much quicker. So what we had based on that system I described to you is everybody was in their own foxhole, right?
The heritage silo data, sorry to cut you off, which is it's just ringing out like a red flag to me, because it's a lot of the same sort of challenges that you see just from the ship owner's perspective, right? You have the chartering side, you have the operations side, you have the technical management side, all kind of with the same data, but oftentimes it's siloed. And maybe there's some things that go across the ETA of the ship we can share with everybody. But as a chartering guy, you didn't really care when the third assistant got off, but you kind of need to know that if you need to build in an extra day for a voyage, right? So again, I'm being, what you're talking about is even at a higher level. I'm sorry to interrupt there, but I think it's that to me is one of the ongoing issues that we see, especially in our space.
For sure. And I think it created a mentality where everyone was reluctant to share their data because it was tied to the commercial relationship that they had with that cargo owner. Folks were reluctant to kind of play in the sandbox of sharing. And that's still, to some extent, and I'll comment more on that in a sec, but it still influences the behavior of the players. Again, enter COVID with this kind of FOMO mentality permeating, fear of missing out, because you had this resurgence in consumer spending, and anybody who sold goods of any kind that were imported from overseas markets didn't want to miss out. So they were either opening up additional sourcing points. Let's say they sourced from China and not from Thailand, but they had a supplier in Thailand. They turned that on, or from Vietnam, or they doubled down with their Chinese suppliers and ordered more because no one wanted to miss out on this enormous resurgence in consumer spending that was going on. I'm not faulting that thinking. I understand it. I can imagine a board meeting or a senior level management meeting going on and folks saying, look, we got to make sure we have goods on the shelves. But there was little or no consideration of the fact that their individual supply chains were not resilient enough to handle the increased cargo that they were ordering themselves. So what happened? It ended up 6:30 News, Lester Holt or Nora O'Donnell, choose your pick. And the lead story was a picture of the San Pedro Bay complex with 75 plus ships queuing, waiting to get a berth to discharge cargo. Why were they waiting for a berth? There was no place to put the cargo to come off those ships because it was building up so much on the terminals themselves, which were never designed to be storage compounds. They were designed to be throughput locations. So back to the data, I think this forced folks to start to think differently. It forced probably, I'm trying to think now, August of 21, the White House appointed a guy named John Porcari to be the first ever port envoy at that time, he was called.
The port czar,
Port
right?
czar.
That was the port czar. Yeah. I remember when that was. Yeah, even though, like I said, I'm on the bulk side. I remember that got a lot of press because I think that was right around the time when the number of ships was the worst, and then Lester Holt or whoever would get up there and talk, the next picture was empty shelves.
Yeah.
It was one picture was the ships, and the next picture was, no toilet paper or something, even though it was well past at that point.
But the White House appointed John into this role, and he was a former Secretary of Transportation in the state of Maryland and had some private sector experience in transport. What he did was he nudged all the private sector interests together, the terminal operators, warehouse operators, truckers, railroads, as well as the public port agencies, and kind of like, all right, guys, what can we do in the next 6 weeks, 12 weeks? You know what I mean? And basically kind of nudged people to make some changes, which helped navigate through the worst periods of the time. And, at the end of the day, the shelves really weren't empty, because for Christmas season 2021, the National Retailers Federation reported that their sales were 15% higher than ever before. So that means the cash register rang, so goods got through, but it was done with a lot of pain and suffering and smoke and mirrors and a lot of stress on the system. But of course, now that's led to some federal funding that previously we've never had, in the form of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, which was signed by the president November 15th, 2021, and more recently by the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes dollars for energy issues, electrification at ports. These are kind of historic dollars that are just now coming into ports through these competitive grant programs. And the truth be told, not a nickel has reached them yet, but they will, over the coming 12 to 24 months, you'll start to see real improvements made, whether it be in electrifying ports to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or whether it just be in the physical infrastructure to modernize in order to move cargo through more efficiently. So that was a big win for us and our members. But it came, like a lot of things in the way we operate in this country, unfortunately, but it is human nature. It came as a result of, a real national drama around this issue, and folks, kind of stepping up and saying, hey, we need to do that. Because as you know, Chris, ports are creatures of municipalities, counties, or states. They are not federal animals. And the federal government was only very lightly involved in funding our nation's ports. Now that's starting to change significantly, and it's becoming part of a more strategic investment. And we hope to continue it. That's our job, is to continue it beyond the current funding cycle, which runs through 2027. That's a discussion still to be held with our lawmakers in the new Congress.
This is really fascinating, again, because coming from my historical background and a lot of people I know, this is kind of new in a way, right? Like to this level. But one of the things that I think it sounds like that I talk about in this podcast, and kind of been a theme that's been peppered along from time to time, a little bit more with the ESG side of things, the emissions side, is collaboration. Are you finding now that with the dollars, there's actually incentive to collaborate again between the different participants within the supply chain on a digital level? Because that's what it sounds like. It had to get done back, 15 months ago when the port Czar was brought on. Is that something that you're seeing, especially on the digitization? On the counter side of that, we saw Maersk and IBM kind of shelve their collaborative tool, although it was built around blockchain and things like that. But do you think now with kind of this federal funding that this collaboration on digital side can take place? Are you seeing a little bit more, at least, openness?
Yeah, it has to happen. And yes, there is more open to us. And the way I would argue to our members and to any of the other participants in the ecosystem that is the goods transportation sector is, hey guys, we can't go back and ask the federal government to give us dollars so we can improve our infrastructure if we're not making efforts to liberate data in a way that makes our existing footprints more efficient. So you can't keep coming with your hat in your hand saying, please, sir, can I have some more, if we're not taking the steps to collaborate across the supply chain to make data work for us. I'll go back to my point about the cargo owners before. I think the old rule, the guy with the gold rules, the party in the chain who can have the best influence to accelerate that cooperation of data sharing is the cargo owners, because he pays the bill.
Cargo is king. When I was a shipbroker, cargo is king. Yeah, ship owners influence, and depending on what you're looking at, strong market, but cargo is always king. Second runner up is the ship owners. In this case, maybe the federal government or port authorities with the purse. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
So I see, in this context of data sharing, I see, if I'm a cargo owner, I want to make it a requirement in my commercial agreements, whether it be my ocean carriers, my terminal operators, my truck, rail, warehousemen. I want to make it a requirement that certain data elements are shared in some kind of data portal, which has visibility throughout, in the interest of moving goods faster. Not competitive data, which is going to compromise the relationship between the supplier and that customer, but data about the movement of the goods that can help accelerate and get more out of the assets that we have, whether they be the trucks, the rail, the size of the port, et cetera, et cetera.
I had a conversation the other day, and I think that that's exactly it, because they were talking about having open source data in the airline industry. We don't have that. They said, yeah, here's our data. It's open source for everybody. I forgot what it was. And go ahead. And if you need it, and then you like something, we'll come to an agreement on it. But here, this is open source. Figure out what you want to build based on our data. But here is the kind of the mothership of data in a very uniform way. And I think that that's something that the maritime industry as a whole struggles with, is the uniformness. I don't know what the right word is, of the data, right?
Standardization.
And I even think of something.
Standardization. There's different terms. This is where I mentioned the FMC before. Carl Bensel is an FMC commissioner who's championed this issue. I give the guy kudos. It's a tough issue to bring the industry together on it, but he's really stayed with it. Right now, it's out for public comment, some of the recommendations that the FMC has made. But you need that combination of government pressure coupled with the urgency that the private sector and the public port authorities recognizing that is. And in the end, you and me, the consumer, who is paying the bill on the bottom line of this.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating, and I'm curious to see how the standardization goes there, because on the side where I work, we're looking at how do we standardize, or how are things standardized, right? Because something as simple as a noon report, right? Think about it. LAT, launch, okay, ETA, great. Based on what? Estimated speed, current speed you're making, speed over ground. What are we doing? Right. And it's something as simple as that can get really, different charters, different cargo owners, different owners and different technical managers will all require different things. And all of a sudden you have speed reported a half a dozen different ways. Well, what is the one that we're all going to look at here, folks? And I think that becomes, that's just one example that I'm familiar with. And I'm sure there's dozens of others that are, but this is a very interesting thing. And I'm actually excited to have this conversation, because this is a whole new world of how data can move and stuff, for sure. One of the interesting things that we kind of discussed a little bit before is, we see all this positive stuff, and we see, you talked a little bit about the resistance. Is there a resistance also because of not so much a FOMO, fear of missing out, but a fear of my job, right? That we're going to all of a sudden standardize some data and have this collaboration that it's going to hurt, potentially people at the ports and things like that. Have you encountered a lot of that? Is that something that your members are worried about?
Well, I think when you go back to the history, and I talk about the very foxholed approach to purchasing transportation, I think, when service providers came in and started talking to cargo owners about thinking end to end, I can tell you from personal experience, there were definitely reactions within big manufacturers around the world, not just in our country, about concerns over what this is for my role. But when it comes to sharing of data in the interest of goods movement, I hope not. I hope that wisdom and logic prevails, that we need to do the things to liberate data so that it's used most effectively. I mean, we are the leader. The U.S. is the leader in the world in information technology. but yet it really hasn't found its way into the goods movement industry because of some of these historical issues that I've mentioned. On the labor side, of course, there's the union issue. And, I fully understand that, union management doesn't want to see jobs go away. I get that. I would probably be of the same opinion and if I was part of union management. But I think if you look into the future and you see the projections for how trade's going to grow and the challenges we have now on the manning side of people willing to even work in those jobs, there's a balance between the deployment of technology more broadly, data we're talking about, but technology in the port space, and still having ample number of high-paying union jobs to support the industry. And I think it's just, folks continuing to talk and look into the future about where trade is going. We're going through a little bit of a retrenchment right now, right? Post all this growth that I talked about before. Thank God in some ways, because it's allowing the industry to kind of catch up a little bit and clear and maybe normalize post the COVID. But I think trade's going to continue to grow, maybe not at 7 or 8% a year, but 2 to 3%, still a pretty healthy growth rate on the baseline that we start from.
And I also think looking forward, you have to be ready for the next disruptor. And I hope that the extra funds that the federal government is giving, is allocating out to the ports are used to anticipate, okay, what if we have something similar? We don't have to look that far back. To 9/11 was a disruptor, and now we have this as a disruptor. So you can reasonably anticipate that something that we don't anticipate as an unknown or known. I forgot what was it. Rumsfeld had all those.
You're right.
I forgot all that, but and again, I'm not taking politics side, but I remember there was an unknown known. Anyway, all those things you just have to make. I think it comes down to making the logistics system that includes the transportation much more resilient. And I think it does start with digitization. And I echo your same point. I am a child of 2 union members, my mother and my father. I was a union member. I was a member of the local 333 when I was a tugboatman in New York City. I was a member of the Sailors Union in the Pacific when I sailed as a deckhand, and MEBA District 1 when I sailed as a mate. So I get it. I understand it as well. But at some point, where do you take the realization and growth, and how do you figure that out with the union membership? But something that needs to be conveyed. Hopefully there's a good middle ground there where we can have growth and protect jobs, I think is important. As we wrap up, I love to ask the following question. What are you reading these days? I always like to get an inside view. I had a couple people, actually it came up in personal conversation, reading that book about the tanker that was it was an insurance fraud about the Brillante Virtuoso. That came up a couple of times. What are you reading? Anything interesting? It doesn't have to be shipping related.
It's funny. It's funny.
Tom Clancy or something.
I just finished reading a book called Two If by Sea by a guy named Peter Levesque, who's an executive in the maritime space. He's now president of CMA CGM Americas, but for a long time he was in the terminal operating side of the business, and he wrote a novel, a thriller, which is a really good read. It's a quick read and a good read. But what I'm reading right now is a book called Power Failure, and it's by William Cohen, and it's about the rise and fall of General Electric. My sister bought it for me for Christmas. It's about a 550-page that goes from the very beginnings of how General Electric came together, right up through. There's a lot of Jack Welch in it, and I grew up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where Jack Welch spent about 15 or 18 of his the years when he was rising up the GE hierarchy, and even used to caddy for him back in the day at the Country Club of Pittsfield. So I love kind of all things GE, and it's a great read. I'm of that age that I read 4 pages a night and I'm out cold, so it's going to take a while to read this one, but it's a great book.
Well, I'm not too far behind you. I read about 10. What's really interesting, and I mentioned this on an earlier podcast, I read The Man Who Broke Capitalism about Jack Welch. Okay, that came out last year. Doesn't sound like it's not as comprehensive, but it basically picks up with Jack Welch and how his kind of drive And a lot of the things that GE does, ranked ratings, all this stuff kind of broke a lot of what American businesses look like in some people's opinions. Very interesting read. It talks about everything from the ranked rating system to, the way he would kind of structure deals to come at the end of the quarter to give that end of the quarter bump. And it was, how many quarters in a row where it was double digit growth and all this stuff until it slowly unwound. And it's interesting because my mother did work for a short while in the 70s at GE. And she had her stock. She literally had paper stock, still does, I think, of GE when it would split with it. What's going on? I remember for a while there, it was like, I remember watching the stock price just go up as like printing money. But certainly, I think a good compliment to your book as you get through it 4 pages at a time. I'm there with you though, Chris. Yeah. I'm totally there. I'm like, oh gosh, I'm ready for bed. But this was an enlightening conversation on a part of the business which I don't have a lot of experience in, and I love speaking to people. This is one of the things about doing this is you hear from people that you just, in parts of the industry, yeah, I'm a maritime guy, but what type of so much. And this was fascinating. So thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate your time today for coming on.
Chris, anytime. Thank you.